It has always seemed to me that the truest thing a human being can say about the ultimate nature of existence is nothing at all, and that the entire history of philosophy and theology, from Aristotle in his Lyceum to Plotinus in his school in Rome, to the Kabbalists of Gerona and Safed, to Spinoza grinding his lenses in Amsterdam, is nothing but the record of men and women who knew this perfectly well, and who nevertheless could not stop speaking or building vast cathedrals of thought around a silence that was there before them and will be there after them, and which no cathedral, however magnificent, can ever fill. And I think of this whenever I come upon a passage in the Zohar that says, before he gave any shape to the world, before he produced any form, he was alone, without form, and without resemblance to anything else. And I think of how that word alone contains within it the entire history of human loneliness. The loneliness of the thinker at his desk, the loneliness of the mystic in his ecstasy, the loneliness of the reader who encounters these words in a foreign language in the reading room in a city where he does not know anyone. And I think of how the Ein Sof, which means without end, which means there is no end, is also, in a sense, the name for that loneliness. For what is without end is also what is without companion, without limit, without the comfort of a boundary against which one might lean. And I think of how Azrael of Gerona, who first used the term in the 13th century, understood this. He understood that to speak of the infinite was to speak of an absence so total that it could not even be called an absence, and that the only honest theology was the theology of negation, the via negativa, which says not what God is, but what God is not. It strips away name after name, attribute after attribute, until nothing remains but the bare fact of having stripped, the bare fact of the hand that reaches and finds nothing, which is also, perhaps, everything. And I think of Plotinus, who was born in Lycopolis in the year 205, and who traveled to Alexandria at the age of 27 in search of a teacher, and who found Ammonius Saccas, of whom no written work survives, so that the origin of the entire Neoplatonic tradition, the tradition that shaped Augustine and Pseudo-Dionysius and the Kabbalists and Ficino and the Islamic Falasifa, rests upon the words of a man about whom we know almost nothing, whose teachings exist only in the memory of his students, which is to say, in the memory, in the copy of a voice that spoke in a room in Alexandria 1900 years ago and was heard by a young man from Upper Egypt who would go on to write the Enneads, which his disciple Porphyry arranged in 6 groups of 9. An arrangement that mirrors the path of ascent from ethics to the sensible world, to the soul, to nous, to the one, so that the very structure of the book is a map of the journey it describes. And I think of how this is also the structure of every life, this movement from the practical to the contemplative, from the many to the one, from the noise of the world to the silence at the center of the world, which is also the silence at the center of the self. And I think of Plotinus's last words, I'm striving to give back the divine in me to the divine in the universe, which is perhaps the most beautiful sentence ever spoken by a dying man, and which is also, I think, a description of what happens when we write or read, when we try to make something out of the raw material of our days, which is that we are trying to give back to the world what the world has given us, knowing that we cannot, knowing that the giving and the receiving are the same act, that the hand that gives is the hand that receives, that the Ein Sof contracts and expands and contracts again, and that we are the space it makes when it contracts, the tehiro, the empty space in which something can be. And the problem of the first step, which the Kabbalists argued about for centuries, whether Ein Sof created the world by moving inward as a process of self-reflection, or outward as a process of pure creation and revelation. This problem, which seems too abstract, so remote from the concerns of daily life, is in fact the most intimate problem there is. For it is the problem of every act of making, every act of remembering, every act of love, which is the problem of whether we are discovering something that was always there, hidden in the depths of the self, waiting to be found, or whether we are creating something genuinely new, something that did not exist before the moment of its creation. And I think of how this contraction is also a kind of violence, a tearing, a Tzimtzum in the strictest sense, for to make space for one thing is to exclude all other things. To choose one memory is to let 1,000 others dissolve back into the infinite. And I think of how the Lurianic Kabbalists understood this. They understood that creation was not a gentle unfolding, but a rupture, a breaking, a withdrawal so radical that it left a wound in the fabric of the divine, and that this wound is the world, is us, the space in which we live and move and try to make sense of what has been done to us, which is also what we have done to ourselves, which is the act of becoming separate, becoming finite, of becoming someone rather than everything. And I think of how this is the saddest and the most beautiful thing, that to be is to be limited, to exist is to be a contraction of the infinite, that every life is a Tzimtzum, a drawing in, a making small, and that the longing we feel, the longing for wholeness, for the fullness of the Ein Sof, is the longing of the contracted space to expand again, to return to the state before the contraction, before the first step and the choice to be this rather than everything. And I think of how Plotinus called this the epistrophe, the return, the flight of the alone to the alone with a capital A, and of how he attained it, according to Porphyry, 4 times in the years they spent together. 4 times in all those years, which seems to me both impossibly many and impossibly few. And I think of how the Enneads are arranged so that the last book is about the one, so that the reader who reads from beginning to end is moving toward the same destination as the mystic in ecstasy, toward the same silence. And then there is Spinoza, who ground lenses in Amsterdam, who was excommunicated from the Jewish community at the age of 23, who wrote his ethics in the form of a geometry textbook with definitions and axioms and propositions, as if the infinite could be demonstrated like a theorem, as if God could be proved with the same certainty as the equality of the radii of a circle. And I think of how this form, this geometric form, is itself a kind of Tzimtzum, a contraction of the infinite into the finite space of a proposition, a demonstration, a QED. And I think of Proposition 18, Deus est omnium rerum causa immanens, non vero transiens. God is the immanent and not the transitive cause of all things, which means that God does not stand outside the world and push it into being, but is the world, is the being of the world, is the very fabric and law of what is. And I think of how this is also what the Kabbalists meant when they said that Ein Sof is all that is, that outside of Ein Sof there is nothing, that the world is not separate from God, but is God's self-expression, God's self-contraction, God's way of being something other than the undifferentiated infinite. And I think of how Spinoza, writing in Latin in a small house in The Hague, grinding his lenses, polishing his glass, was doing the same thing as the Kabbalist in Safed, the same thing as Plotinus in Rome, the same thing as Aristotle in Athens, which is trying to say what cannot be said, trying to name what has no name, trying to make the infinite fit into the finite space of a sentence, a proposition, a book. And I think of how the act of grinding a lens is itself a metaphor for this. For what is a lens but a piece of glass that has been shaped, contracted, limited, so that it can focus the infinite light into a single point, so that the boundless can be made visible. And I think of how Spinoza died at the age of 44, of a lung illness, probably caused by the glass dust he had been breathing for years, so that the very act of trying to make the infinite visible was also the act that killed him. the glass dust in his lungs, the fine powder of the infinite ground down to a point. And I think of how this is the fate of every thinker and every writer, every person who tries to grasp what cannot be grasped. That the grasping is also a being ground down, a being made fine, a being reduced to powder, and that the powder settles in the lungs and slowly, over years, makes it impossible to breathe. And the question of creation, whether it is inward or outward, discovery or invention, I do not think it can be resolved. It's also the question of memory, of writing, of the act by which we try to preserve what has been lost. For when I sit down to write about a place I once visited or a person I once knew, am I discovering something that was always there, waiting in the archive of my experience, or am I creating something new, something that did not exist before the act of writing? Something that is not the memory itself, but the memory as written, which is a different thing entirely, a contraction of the infinite fullness of the experience into the finite space of a sentence. And I think of how the Ein Sof in the Lurianic telling did not create the world by adding something to itself, but by subtracting, by making a space where it was not. And I think of how this is also what writing does, how it makes a space in the fullness of experience where a single image can stand, a single memory can be held up to the light and examined. And this tehiru, this empty space, is the most precious thing there is, for without it there is no world, no thought, no language, no love. Only the undifferentiated fullness of the Ein Sof, which is everything and therefore nothing, which is infinite and therefore empty, which is all and therefore, in a sense, the same as the nothing that preceded it. And I think of how the Zohar reduces the term Ein Sof to Ayin, to nothing, because God so transcends human understanding as to be practically non-existent. Surely we'll fail to know. But the attempt itself, the reaching, the striving, is the only prayer there is, the only theology and philosophy, the only act of creation that matters, which is the act of contracting, of making space, of letting something be, of saying in the face of the infinite, here, this small thing, this sentence, this memory, this moment, this is what I have made of the boundless. This is what remains when the Ein Sof withdraws and leaves me alone in the empty space, with nothing but my own small light, my own small name, which is also no name at all, which is also silence, which is also the face of the faceless one looking back at me from the page or the glass or the lens or the dust, from the nothing that is everything, and from the everything that is nothing, from the Ein Sof, the boundless, the endless, the nameless, the faithless, the alone.